I'm Tom Kennedy, Chairman and CEO of the Raytheon Company, and I'm honored to introduce the next session on the Air Force's role in national security. Now, we're very fortunate today to have the utmost expert in this area. That's the 23rd Secretary of the Air Force, Deborah Lee James.
Thank you.
And she has a lot of responsibilities. I'm going to just cover a few of them because it's pretty outstanding. As Secretary, her responsibilities include the organizing, training, and equipping and providing for the welfare of its more than 690,000 active duty, Guard, Reserve, and civilian airmen and their families. She also oversees the Air Force's annual budget of more than $110 billion. Secretary James was sworn in on December 20th, 2013, bringing with her more than 30 years of senior homeland and national security experience in both the federal, government, and private sectors. As Secretary, her priorities include nuclear, space, and cyber, and she is keenly focused on people and diversities. Now, given the subject, we have tapped a moderator, one of the leading media experts on the topic, Fox's News national security correspondent, Jennifer Griffin. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Jennifer.
Thank you very much, Tom. Thank you. Well, thank you for joining us. Thank you to Walter Isaacson and to Clark for hosting this incredible, it's a veritable who's who in the national security establishment, and it really has been an amazing few days. So thank you for that, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. Our panel is called Flying the Unfriendly Skies, the Air Force Role in National Security. If any of you were flying United the other day, you might have seen how the skies have changed, not as friendly as they once were. Deb James is not just the 23rd Air Force Secretary, she's also the second woman to head the Air Force and lead the Air Force. She's one of a very few women that I can even think of who have ever headed an armed service in our Pentagon. She's a graduate of Duke University. She has a master's in international affairs from Columbia. She served on the House Armed Services Committee on the as part of the committee in the 80s. And then in the 90s, she moved to DOD and dealt with reserve affairs. She moved to industry, and before she was appointed by the president in 2013, she was working for SAIC. She was approved by the Senate by 79-6. I hope you know who those 6 were.
I know who those 6 were.
Because you probably put them on some drone list.
But I'm forgiving. I'm a very forgiving person.
Your nomination was actually held up because of the A-10 issue, so we can get into that in a moment. But I want to paint for you an incident that occurred on July 4th. We just had the Russian ambassador here. I don't know if he's here right now, but 2 Russian Tupolev Bear bombers, strategic bombers, made their way to the coast of California. They made their way to within 39 miles of Mendocino, California, and the pilots of those planes had a message for the F-15 pilots who had to be scrambled to meet them. They said, "Good morning, American pilots. We are here to greet you on your 4th of July Independence Day." Was that a friendly message in the skies?
It was a rather unusual message in the skies, Jennifer, and if I could just take a moment and also thank you and thank the organizers of this tremendous conference. You already said it, it's a who's who, and I only regret that I didn't get here earlier to be able to hear some of these fantastic presentations. It was a most unusual message, and we have been seeing and tracking on such unusual occurrences of late, which are worrisome to us in the United States government. So we have seen more aggressive behavior on the part of Russian pilots. There is, in the world of the air forces of the world, there is what's called professional behavior, and then there's behavior which is less professional. Professional behavior involves indications and warnings. It involves having your transponders on. It involves sometimes having flight plans, not always, but sometimes. These are examples of professional behaviors, and what we have seen is we have seen a rise of more unprofessional behavior, which is worrisome to us.
Do you think they were just testing our response time, or do you think that it's just almost a jab and a joke? I mean, how do you view this?
Well, of course, I don't know for sure, but I would speculate yes, yes, and yes. I think it may have been a little bit of all of the above.
Now, General Joe Dunford was just on Capitol Hill for his confirmation hearing and to be the next chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And General Paul Selva, who is an Air Force general, is going to be his vice. He was at his own confirmation hearing last week, and they both were asked what are the 5 greatest threats that the U.S. is facing right now. And they put Russia, General Dunford had Russia, China, North Korea, then ISIS. General Selva had Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and then ISIS. And what's notable to me is that ISIS is pretty far down on that list. And in fact, if, General Selva said at the time, quote, ISIS does not present a clear and present threat to our homeland and to the existence of our nation. And what I'm noticing at the Pentagon is that the military does not see ISIS as an existential threat. What would your top 5 threats to the U.S. be?
So if I were to try to pick countries or peoples around the world which are acting or investing or in some way being threatening to Americans and American interests, so if I just focus on that first, I would agree and I would put Russia at the top of the list. I would not have said that 2 years ago, but a lot has happened in the last couple of years. And so I would agree with Russia being number 1. Number 2, I believe I would put ISIS / Al-Qaeda / extremism in the Middle East. I think I would put that as a number 2 threat to Americans and American interests around the globe. Next, I would probably put China, particularly for the long-term aspects there. After China, I believe I would put North Korea and followed by Iran. Iran being at the bottom of the list because hopefully, if all goes well, we have a deal which would put off for years the possibility of a nuclear weapon. Now, there's a couple of capabilities that I would put right up there. I don't mean to give a 6th and a 7th here, but they're really important capabilities and they underpin everything. So I would put in there cyber. There are cyber threats around the globe which are extremely worrisome. And I would also put in investments that could threaten our capabilities in space. So I would add cyber and space to that category as well.
Let me ask you about the Iran deal, since that's been in the news so much. And the Air Force would play a key role if that deal falls apart. The Air Force is the tip of the spear in terms of a military plan should the U.S. have to do something about Iran's nuclear program, again, if this deal doesn't work. Do you think, given the budget cuts and the size of the Air Force right now compared to 7 years ago, for instance, that you could carry out an effective air campaign against Iran? And is the Air Force large enough to provide a deterrent against Iran?
So you're right. We have had budget cuts. We're worried about sequestration, and we are the smallest Air Force that we have ever been since our inception as a separate service in the year 1947. But with that said, based on everything that I know and that I've seen in the year and a half that I've been privileged to have this job, we are still the best Air Force on the planet. And so I am certain that whatever we are called upon to do, whatever type of a mission that we are called upon to do, we will step up to the plate, we will send our most effective and our best trained personnel, our most modern capabilities, and we will get the job done.
How big is the U.S. Air Force compared to China's Air Force, Russia's Air Force, and Iranian capabilities?
So in terms of sheer size of our Air Force as compared to some of the other forces, we have more people, we have more aircraft. I will say some of the other countries have larger ground forces, and the key point I want to leave you with, though, and what worries me, is from a capability standpoint, whereas we used to have absolute control of the skies for decades, and without too much concern about maintaining the control of the skies, other countries are catching up to us in capabilities. And of course, my job is not to pick a fight with anybody. I don't want to fight with anybody around the world. But my job is to make sure that we're ready no matter what happens. And that means we've got to have the right people, we've got to have the right training, we've got to have the right capabilities today, and we have to invest for the future.
how have those other countries managed to catch up in terms of their warplanes? We heard yesterday from some of the U.S. officials who were on panels that one of the ways in which China has acted in terms of cyber is that they use cyber as a means to steal the plans for the F-35. Is that true?
I think certainly other countries engage in espionage. They engage in industrial espionage, and there's espionage against governments as well. So there's a factor there. I think another factor, which perhaps many Americans don't think about, is that really the first time that the fruits of the investments that were made back in the 70s and 80s in stealth and precision technology. The first time that the world at large saw these capabilities on the world scene was during the Persian Gulf War. Mm-hmm. And I think that was perhaps an eye-opening experience for those around the world who saw just how quickly we could project power, the enormity of that power, the precision of that power. And ever since that time, which is 25 years ago, just about, I think countries have been investing and they have been testing, they have been watching us, and they have been replicating to the greatest extent possible some of the techniques you just mentioned, but they have been catching up to us in some of these key ways. They've also been investing, I mentioned cyber and space. These are, as we call them, asymmetric capabilities, and they have also been focusing on this as well, which is why I say I don't ever want a fair fight. If I have to fight, I want to be one or two or three steps ahead of the competition.
Do you feel you have the ability right now to protect the plans of these warplanes so that the competitive nations are not able to steal the technology that we've invested so much money in to develop these state-of-the-art planes? Do you feel that's protected now, or are you concerned about that?
I'm always concerned about cyber. So we have probably within the defense and the intelligence communities, we probably have the best protections of anyone in the world. But are they good enough? Are there vulnerabilities still out there? The answer to that is we are constantly surveying, we are constantly looking, and when we find issues that concern us, we try to plug the holes. I might add that there's folks from industry in the audience. Industry has to be on their toes as well. When I was in SAIC, for example, I mean, we were very focused on this. We were worried about our networks protecting some of the secrets that we were entrusted with by the U.S. government, and so would hope that industry would continue to double down on this effort as well.
But as far as you know, has anything changed in terms of the collaboration between industry and the Air Force in terms of protecting from these cyber attacks?
I think it's gotten better each and every year, but I'm not satisfied that it's good enough, and we have to keep on it.
Now, an Air Force lab in the last week put out a $10 million offer for a solution to bombing hard and deeply buried sites underground. Coming on the heels of the Iran deal, one can only think of Fardo. Was that designed to send a message that we're trying to keep a credible military option?
Well, first of all, we always have a credible military option on the table. So whether or not that request for information had ever gone out, rest assured there is always a credible military option on the table. Because even if we proceed, as I hope we will, and that we have a deal, remember, the deal is not built on necessarily trust, it is built on verification. And should the time come in the future when through verification means it appears that the deal is not being upheld, sanctions would resume, and of course the military option is never off the table. So I'm not actually familiar with that exact RFI that you just mentioned, but of course our laboratories, they're always thinking years and years ahead, trying to build the next capability. They're trying to survey industry to see what capabilities and ideas are out there. And so my guess is that is not directly tied to the Iranian situation at all. Rather, it is simply our labs leaning forward and always trying to come up with the next best technology.
How concerned are you that the arms embargo, both conventional as well as the embargo on ICBM parts for Iran, will be lifted if they comply with this deal? Those embargoes will be lifted in 5 and 8 years. How concerned are you if Iran is allowed to import ICBM parts or export them?
Well, of course, I'm always concerned about these matters as the Secretary of the Air Force, but based on everything that I have seen on the agreement, I am convinced that it's a good deal. It's the best deal that we could hope for under these circumstances, and that the totality of the deal takes off the table the various paths that Iran might have to develop this nuclear weapon over the next decade or so, with verification measures, not based on trust, but based on verification. And if there's cheating or things that are not correct in the years to come, we have ways to resume other means.
Mm-hmm. And the inclusion this year at Red Flag, which is the preeminent military exercise, air exercise out at Nellis, the inclusion of Israel's F-15I long-range bombing unit, they haven't been involved in the last few years. Is that designed to send a message to Iran?
Well, Red Flag is, as you pointed out, Jennifer, this is our premier, what we call high-end readiness training approach. So this is where we, together with our joint partners in, let's say, the Navy, together with coalition partners, where we practice against some of the most difficult, challenging threats in a simulated environment, of course, but that we could come up against in the real world. So we've been at this for 40 years. And Israel participates periodically. As you mentioned, they're going to be going there this year. I think 2009 was the last time they were there. So it comes and goes according to budget pressures and whatnot. So is it a signal? I think the signal I would read into it is that Israel is a very close partner of the United States. And for us to have these periodic exercises together makes both of us better.
Great. Do you think in our lifetime that Iran will get a nuclear bomb?
I hope not. I hope not.
We all do. Let's switch to your role as Secretary of the Air Force, being the second woman. Tell me about when you came into the job, you were expecting to have to deal with what the hot button issue at the time was, which was an unprecedented number of sexual assault cases involving the Air Force. The Air Force was being hammered by that in the media. You come into office and you find that within a few weeks that the bigger scandal is actually out at the nuclear bases in Montana, that the all the airmen who have the codes basically to launch nuclear weapons, there had been a cheating scandal and dozens were involved in this. How did you handle that, and what did you do when you came in? And were you surprised that you were having to face this variety of kind of social issues really in the Air Force as opposed to dealing with planes and weaponry?
So yes, the missile situation surprised me. It's the old saying about the box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. So that was a chocolate that I wasn't exactly expecting to get. But it didn't really surprise me that I would spend a lot of my focus and a lot of my time on people issues, because an awful lot of everything really boils down to people now, doesn't it? I think it does. So how did I handle it? The first thing I did was I got myself better informed, because I think I was either 2 or 3 weeks old on the job at the time it came to my attention. And in case some of you haven't followed this closely, what happened was there was a drug investigation on the part of some of our young officers who were sitting watch over nuclear forces. And as part of the drug investigation, cell phones were confiscated and looked at forensically. And out of that, it was discovered that there had been cheating on a proficiency test that these young officers took every month. So when I first learned about this, I thought, wow, this is big. Because to me, I questioned immediately the safety and security of our nuclear forces. I thought, if our young officers are cheating on a test which demonstrates proficiency, does this mean that our nuclear forces are not safe and secure? So flash forward like 2 days after lots of briefings and lots of discussions, the answer to that was no. Cheating is bad, but there's lots of checks and balances, so the nuclear forces were safe and secure. But nonetheless, what's going on and what are we going to do about it? So the next thing was we decided we're going to go public with this. We're not going to pretend it didn't happen, and we're going to essentially meet the press and tell, this is what we know, this is what we don't yet know, and this is what we're going to do to try to get back, or to find out, and we'll get back to you. And from there, I went out, and so did General Welsh, our Chief of Staff of the Air Force, and we toured the missile bases. And for me, it was the first time I'd seen the facilities, seen the silos, seen any of this. Also, in addition, we got briefings from the leaders on scene. And then the third thing, which is important to me, was I did focus groups alone with the team at all the missile bases to try to draw out of people, from their perspective, what was really going on here. So anyway, from all of that, we returned to Washington and we compared notes, and we had surprisingly similar impressions. Number one impression was this was not something isolated to that one base. We never found evidence of cheating beyond that one base, but we did find evidence of systemic problems across the board. So that was number one, which to me meant we needed a holistic approach, not just deal with a cheating incident. Number two, it was very much a people issue, and we needed to do more things, everything from different training, different incentives, different developmental opportunities for this nuclear force. There were readiness issues concerning the equipment of today that we needed to address, and modernization issues for tomorrow. So we redirected manpower and money toward this force. So there's a lot of changes going on. I personally go back about every 6-7 months just to keep my finger on the pulse of how things are going. Matter of fact, earlier this week, I was at one of our nuclear bases, and so what I would tell you is I think we're making good progress. Is it perfect yet? Is it all fixed? No. But I think progress is being made. That's what the teams are telling me when I shut the door and we go alone. So we just have to keep on it.
What did these teams tell you about the pressure that they felt out there on these silos, and describe what it's like where they serve? Because I'm not sure, being, since the Cold War is basically over, I think we sometimes forget that there are young airmen in silos still, on 24/7 watch in case the call comes.
So if you can picture this, it's a very remote location, principally out in the western states. The young officers who are the missileers, but then there's other people around them who help maintain, who defend the areas and so forth. So it's not just the missileers, but again, they're in very remote locations. They do go down on a 24-hour watch. Some people posit that, wow, this must be boring because, there hasn't been a nuclear weapon launched at the United States ever. Well, it's not boring. I went down there, and it is almost a frenetic pace of things happening. They're exercising at all times, practicing their skills, and then there's real-world situations that happen, having to do with maintenance, or the defending forces in the surrounding area will pick up on some piece of intelligence, or the sensors will go off and everybody will respond. So to me, things were happening constantly for the period of time that I visited. So they're there. It is a stressful situation because obviously this is life and death decisions should they be called upon to do it in the real world. And interestingly enough, my take, the reason why they cheated on that exam and what triggered all of this was not in order to pass. They cheated, in my opinion, because they were trying to get 100. They wanted to get a perfect score. And the reason why they wanted to get a perfect score is because the promotion authorities, the people who would be looking at their records and deciding whether or not they would get promoted to the next level, were using those test scores as the major differentiator as to who would get promoted or not. So that was, to me, the tragedy of the whole thing, that the way we had this testing environment set up, people felt that they needed to cheat in order to get 100 in order to get promoted. Needless to say, that is not happening anymore.
In your role as the Air Force Secretary, I think you were the first person in the Pentagon to state publicly that you thought the ban on transgender troops should be lifted, and that's now occurred. Why did you think it was so important to do that?
Well, what I said some time ago, and I think I might have been actually the second, if I'm not mistaken,
okay.
Former Secretary Hagel said something very similar to my sentiment, and my feeling was, what I want to know about you is I want to know, are you capable at your job? Are you performing your job well? And then the second thing I want to know about you is, do you live our core values in the Air Force? Do you believe and live in integrity, service before self, and excellence in all we do? And if you are doing your job capably, and if you're living those core values, then you're the type of person that I want in my Air Force. So that's the way I feel. I don't look at those other sorts of labels, and I think those other sorts of labels are rather passé nowadays. Times have changed. With that said, we do have a policy in place which prohibits the accession of transgender people into the military. And then if you come to believe that you're transgender or realize it while you're already in service, you may or may not be involuntarily separated. So that's the policy of today, and it's basically based on medical issues. Well, once again, it seems to me that times change. Medical knowledge marches forward. We know different things now as compared to years ago. And so I question whether or not this is the way to go for the future. Well, Secretary Carter, more importantly, is also questioning it. And so what we've done now is he has launched a 6-month review where we're going to look at this matter specifically. And it's a lean forward type of a review. The presumption is this is going to open up, and we're going to practically look at this about how to implement, what sorts of practical accommodations might need to be made, and so forth. Of course, there's also the possibility for a request for waivers or exemptions in certain areas. So this is where everybody will have their say on this, and 6 months from now, we should have a new policy to march forward.
The issue of women in combat, women in special operations has come up since we've been here, and there have been different responses. Former head of SOCOM, Admiral Eric Olson, had some remarks that got some attention yesterday, in which he essentially said that, I'll paraphrase because I don't think you were here, he essentially said that, well, as a society, he has concerns about this going into certain units. Now, women have been attached to SOF units before, but they haven't been in the SEALs and Rangers and Delta Force. And he said he's concerned that, or he thinks that if we're going to open these roles up to women, and if we're going to still force men to serve, if they're going to have selective service, and men are required to register for that, then women will have to be required to register for that. And he said something that got some attention in terms of, as a society, if we're ready to stop saying women and children first and say every man for himself, then maybe we can have this discussion. What is your reaction to the issue of women in combat as well as in some of these special operator roles?
So I look upon this matter as I look upon the earlier matter that we discussed. So what I want to know is, are you capable of doing the job? And are you excellent at the job? And if the answer is yes, then I move on to, how about the core values? Is this the way you live your professional life and so forth? And if the answer to that is yes, then I want you in my Air Force. So my answer is very similar. Now, when it comes to women in service, I used to be on something before I came into the Air Force called DACOWITS, the Defense Advisory Committee on Women in the Services. So this is where, one of the ways that I kind of became passionate about issues affecting women. And we were tracking on closed specialties and efforts to open up those specialties. We were also tracking on issues like sexual assault in the military, which is not just a women's issue, it's a people issue. So what I believed then and what I believe now is that we need, and we're working on this, gender-neutral standards for all of these jobs in the military, because that will tell us whether or not an individual, be it a man or a woman, can do the job and can do the job capably. These standards might be of a mental nature, or they may be of a physical nature, or maybe both. And that's what we're putting in place. And so the go-forward approach, by order of actually former Secretary Panetta, is that we will open up the remaining jobs for women that are currently closed, provided that we have in place gender-neutral standards. We'll allow people to compete. Only qualified people who can do the job would, of course, fill those jobs. But there is the opportunity for all the military services, including, in this case, SOCOM, to come forward and ask for and demonstrate why an exemption should be allowed for certain categories if anybody proposes such exemptions.
jobs in the Air Force are closed to women right now?
There's 6 or 7 jobs that are currently closed, so we're the most open at the moment. The 6 or 7 jobs happen to be very closely aligned to the special operations world.
Do you anticipate requesting an exemption for any of those?
Well, I'm going to wait and reserve judgment, but my lean forward position is if there is a request coming up to me for an exemption, the burden of proof would be heavy to demonstrate to me why that should be so if we're talking about gender neutral standards and simply requiring that all sorts of people be able to meet those standards.
Great. With that, I think we'll open it to your questions. So if you can raise your hand and we'll bring you a microphone. Yes. Yes, please.
Bernie Cooney, a former Air Force Academy graduate and Air Force B-52 crew member. Thank you very much for your service and for your remarks tonight. It was very good. Because of all the concern over the years that when I was in the service, dealing with Soviet ground-to-air missiles, goes way back to Vietnam, North Vietnam. I was surprised by the recent announcement by Russia just about a month prior to the Iran agreement, that Russia was going to reinstate their contract with Iran to install an entire system of air defense missiles on all of the nuclear sites in Iran. Now this is the S-300, S-400 system, and it's a very, very sophisticated system. And we've seen what Russian anti-aircraft systems can do in Ukraine, where as far as everybody knows, the Indonesian airliner that was shot down by a Russian ground-to-air missile.
Since we're short of time,
Sure.
do you have a question for?
Well, the question is,
Yeah.
in terms of Air Force capability, has that been factored into the whole equation in terms of maintaining a capability to strike Iran if they do go nuclear and don't comply with the agreement?
So there are dozens of countries around the world these days that have similar integrated air defenses, surface-to-air missiles, which is one of those aspects where it's worrisome to the United States because it threatens our ability to control the skies. So the key thing there is, do we have the capability to defeat those systems? Can we get in undetected by certain radars and whatnot? And so I'll just say to you that not all of our platforms have such capabilities. Not all of our platforms are as survivable as some of the more modern ones. But as I was telling you, our job is to always make sure that the president has options. You've heard other leaders say the military option would remain on the table just in case. And so we're well aware of that, and we would be prepared to step up and do our job if called upon to do so.
I would be remiss in not asking you about the opening of the Turkish air bases. That's news in the last 24 hours. The Turks are now carrying out airstrikes in northern Syria. How is that? Do you consider that a game changer to the fight against ISIS? And how will that help the Air Force? What couldn't you do before because you didn't have access to those bases?
So I also read that in the news. I have not yet gotten confirmation, like from the government sources, that that's 100% accurate. But let me just say, if it is accurate, and I hope it is, that would be a very, very positive development, because to the extent we have more ability to maneuver and fly different types of missions from different locations, I mean, this is only a helpful thing. It is certainly not a harmful thing. And to the extent that the Turks, who also have quite a capable Air Force, are more engaged, these are all very positive developments.
Where do you stand on forward air controllers? Do you believe they should be on the ground helping with the airstrikes in Iraq and Syria?
So on that, I tend to lean and listen very carefully to people like General Dempsey and those who have had that direct combat experience on the ground. So what he has said is that he would not hesitate to call for that if he believed it to be necessary. Keep in mind now, we to put just a small number of combat air controllers on the ground, there's a certain amount of support and protective personnel and equipment that would need to go with them. So it would be more than just a few if we were to do that. I'll also tell you this, modern technology is allowing us to have these so-called combat air controllers in safe locations with their commanders, their ground commanders nearby. They can watch feeds from our ISR assets overhead, and they can go a long way toward doing their job through that different approach. So we do have combat air controllers that are quite engaged, but just in a different way.
Do we have another question? Yes, please.
Hi, Toby Harshaw from Bloomberg View. I actually have 4 short questions about the long-range bomber. Do you still plan on awarding that contract in the fall? Do you know roughly how many it will be for? Is there any truth to the rumors that it will be capable of unmanned missions? And why do we need it?
I can't ever remember 4 things in a row, can you? No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. So I feel a little bit with respect to the long-range strike bomber, I feel like I'm trapped in a Jerry Seinfeld episode, because remember Seinfeld was a show about nothing, but they would go on and talk and make jokes for a half an hour anyway. So there's like literally nothing new to say about the long-range strike bomber. We're close to making a decision on the EMD contract. When exactly it'll be, you know, I can't really say because I don't know, but it'll be ready when it's ready, and it shouldn't be too much longer. And once again, for those who may not be tracking this constantly, the key thing about this bomber is it is going to be a leap ahead capability for the United States. It'll be the future of our bomber force. Our bombers are among the oldest aircraft in our inventory. They've served us well, but there's only so much time they have left on the airframes. So we really do need to get on with it and get this capability for the United States.
Yes, sir.
Alan Asay, retired Kathy. Given the age of the ICBM force and given the fact that we've got a nasty budget situation, why are we retaining the ICBM force?
Why aren't we retaining?
Why are we? I mean, it's an
we?
old force, it's a target, it's expensive, it will never be upgraded.
Well, we are retaining the ICBM force as one leg of our triad. Of course, it goes along with our bombers that we want to modernize, as well as with our submarine sea-based deterrent. And I'll just answer it like this. I know different people have obviously different opinions on this, but the triad has worked very, very well for us for 60 or 70 years, and I, for one, am not willing to mess with that success. And yes, there's a certain amount of money involved, and it sounds like an enormous amount of taxpayer dollars, and it is over time. I don't make light of that. But if you look at it vis-a-vis the whole, it's a very, very small percentage of our overall defense capability, and look what it has bought us all these many years. It has been the deterrent which has held off the one and only, to the best of my knowledge, existential threat, meaning a threat that could wipe, you know, millions of people out. It has held that off for the better part of 7 decades. And so we will be modernizing it. It'll be done over time. It's called the ground-based strategic deterrent. And so I say stay tuned. We got to do the same for our sea-based forces. And you already heard, obviously, we're moving on with the long-range strike bomber. So I say, how can we not afford it? We're going to have to make room for it. We just got to make it work.
Do we have another question? Yes, sir.
Yes, ma'am. Chip Burris. Should women register or be forced to register for selective service?
Well, in my opinion, yes. I see no reason for it. I see no reason why not to have that requirement for both men and women.
Interesting. Can I ask you about Iraq right now? Air power has taken a bit of a hit because a lot of former generals who were involved in the Gulf War, 43-day air war, air power was at its height for that war, are saying, and I'll quote General Deptula, who said, "We've been applying air power like a rain shower or a drizzle. For it to be effective, it needs to be applied like a thunderstorm." Do you think that the Air Force is going to be blamed if the Air Force alone can't stop ISIS?
Well, I certainly hope not, because it was never part of the plan that the Air Force alone would stop ISIS. This is the plan from the start, has been that this would be a whole of government approach together with the coalition. The Air Force is the lead in terms of the air power piece of this, but from the very beginning, the notion has been that we need troops on the ground, boots on the ground, and the name of those boots on the ground is the Iraqi Army, the good guys in Syria, if we can get them trained up and identified, and of course the allies who've been fantastic, known as the Peshmerga. So that's the ground forces, and they've got to do their part. We, the coalition air forces, are doing our part. And I would also say, with respect to the Persian Gulf War analogy and the quote that you just gave from General Deptula, I think they're fundamentally different operations. So whereas in the Persian Gulf War, we, the United States Air Force and the coalition, we were going up against a military force on the ground, the forces of Saddam Hussein. This is a whole different ballgame. This is groups of terrorists who are, think nothing of mixing themselves in with children and in schools and mosques and with civilian populations. And so for us to take the approach that we took in Desert Storm, where we were going against military blocks, which were very visible on the ground, you could tell who's who, for us to take a similar approach, many civilians would perish. And I think that would ultimately be very counterproductive. We value innocent human life, and we go to great pains and great care to protect it.
What about complaints that the rules of engagement for pilots are too tight? They're returning back to base sometimes 3 out of 4 times with their bombs still intact. What about those complaints? Are they legitimate?
I have asked our top commanders that very question, and what they report back to me is that the rules of engagement, in their opinion, are about right. The rules of engagement, and I'm paraphrasing here, say something to the effect of, we will minimize collateral damage and we will minimize dangers to innocent life. So that to me sounds about right. And as I said, what's difficult here is it's difficult because this is the type of an enemy who will mix in with civilian populations and in locations to include buildings like schools and mosques, things that we simply, our values do not allow for us at this time at least to take them out. And so we go with great care, we watch and we wait and we get the best intelligence that we can and we strike when we're ready. And that is proceeding at pace according to our top commanders.
We have time for one more question. Yes, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Scott Cooper. I'm at Human Rights First, but I'm a retired Marine aviator and spent a lot of time flying with the Air Force. I wonder if I could take you over to the F-35. It's the largest acquisition program in history. We've had program delays and cost overruns. What have we learned from that experience, and what changes have you been able to implement so that we don't have some of those mistakes that we've occurred over this program?
The biggest lesson I have learned from the F-35 is never again should we be flying an aircraft while we're building it. In other words, the concurrency in the F-35 program, though in the beginning people thought that was a good idea, that we could go faster, cheaper, better, if you can believe it. If you go back many years when this whole thing started, that was actually the idea, that we could get a lot done through these new technologies and through simulations and whatnot, and that the degree of concurrency would work. Indeed, it has not worked as well as we had hoped, and that's probably the understatement of the day. So if I could go back, believe me, if I could go back and rewrite history and redo the acquisition strategy on the F-35, I would. I don't know anybody who wouldn't, because it has taken too long. It cost us way more money than we ever imagined possible. But, of course, I don't have that capacity to go back. The best I can do is from this day forward. And so that's why I and others who are involved with the program have been very focused from now on to driving the costs down, and they are down per unit of the F-35. They're coming down. We've got to do the same thing on sustainability and the life cycle cost. We've got to keep driving it down, and we need to push it over the finish line and reach what we call initial operating capability, and then a few years more will be the full operating capability so that it really is the combat power that we need it to be. So the Marines, as I'm sure you know, are just around the corner. They're getting close. We, the U.S. Air Force, we're about a year, a little bit more than a year perhaps, still to go. There's still plenty of challenges. I would sum it up in one word: software. So software is hugely important. The F-35 is like a flying computer with 24 million codes, lines of code of software. You compare that to the aircraft of the older aircraft, it's more like 250,000. So software used to be a little deal, now it's a huge deal. So that's still the long pole in the tent, but we're hopeful we're going to get it done, IOC, by next summer or so, and then we move on from there.
Great. Well, with that, I think we'll, excuse me? Would you go ahead?
Certainly.
The F-35 lost to an F-16 in a dogfight a couple months ago. Could you comment on that?
So that was part of a testing protocol where they test in all different types of directions, the operational capability of new aircraft like the F-35. And you're right, it didn't do so well in that particular test, in that particular role-playing that they were doing at the time. So that's a data point. But I will tell you this, the power of the F-35 lies in its design, which is what's called low observability. Think stealth, think it can fly under the radar, so to speak, of many systems around the world. Its speed, its persistence, its range, the payloads that it can carry, the ability to not have to refuel as often as some of the other aircraft. These are all of the leap-ahead technologies, and most importantly, the ability to fuse information in ways that have never been done, which give pilots unbelievable situational awareness. So the whole idea of the F-35 is to launch combat power in a conflict such that we see an enemy hundreds of miles in the distance, we get the first weapon off, we deliver the first punch, and the bad guys don't even know what hit them. They don't even see us coming. That's the idea. The idea is not a close-in dogfight. But with that said, by the time we're at full operational capability, it'll be much better in that arena as well.
And with that, I want to thank Secretary James for her time.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you all.